There were some thoughts I knew I specifically wanted to share with you carefully, and so I wrote those down. And there's another part of the talk where I felt the desire to be a little more extemporaneous, so I did not write those parts down. So I'm going to start with the prepared thoughts and then go into a story to share with you all. When I was asked to provide a piece of music, which we're listening to begin my short time with you, I pondered several options. In most cases, I wanted a song that would contain a strong narrative, or also a song that might just be loud and shock the room, but then I began to feel like there was something predictable in that choice. I did know that it needed to be a song from an artist with whom I felt a particular affinity. So I scoured my collection for just the right Kate Bush, or maybe the right Joni Mitchell, and I quickly realized that we would have to hear the whole song and pay attention to it to get a whole story, even to begin to do the idea justice. So I went back and thought about music the way I do on a production, when I'm working with a sound designer on the first cue of a production of a play. What sound would create a certain mood, serve as a preface to begin something? In this case, what sound would open the ritual invitation to the imagination to hold forth, to inspire us to share our ideas, our thoughts, our stories, and yet a music that I could still identify for myself as personally representative. The music we're hearing is one of my favorites, composed by British composer Ralph Vaughan Williams, named 5 variants on Dives and Lazarus. I used this music as the opening cue to the very first professional production I ever directed at what would be my home theater for many years. It was in the 1980s. I also picked it today to serve as a sound that might underscore the words of a British poet, writing about a century earlier than Vaughan Williams, the poet Letitia Elizabeth Landon, and in her short poem, The Power of Words, she conveys something of the mystery of words, how we use them, what they do to us when we allow them to have an impact. She writes, "The power of words. 'Tis a strange mystery, the power of words. Life is in them, and death. A word can send the crimson color hurrying to the cheek, hurrying with many meanings, or can turn the current cold and deadly to the heart. Anger, fear are in them, grief and joy. They are all in their sound, yet slight, impalpable. A word is but a breath of passing air." The theater is a place where we enact our stories. It is a place where we share secrets, shine a glaring light on our take on truth, evoke a world that causes a series of actions to occur for good or for ill, for tragic ends, for comedic ones. The theater exists to exalt in the possibilities and actualities of what it means to be a human being. Why do we do this? What good, if any, can come from such an endeavor? The short story I want to share with you today might begin to shed some light for you as it did for me. I think there's probably no one involved in the arts who doesn't spend a good deal of time thinking about what more worthwhile pursuit might they take on with their life that might actually be more useful certainly more compensatorily favorable. But in any way, you sometimes can be stymied by the notion of the existential meaning of a life in the art. Fortunately, as a young man at the age of 19, I had an experience that in some ways allowed me a touchstone to refer back to whenever I would begin to get stymied or paralyzed by the thought of, why do this? I was a rising junior, an undergraduate. The year was 1974. I was a theater major studying in Washington, D.C. at the Catholic University of America. And I guess because of our proximity to the government, studying in Washington, we had the opportunity as undergraduates to sometimes do performances for the State Department, traveling to parts of the world that were considered cultural exchange programs, where young Americans would be injected into the culture of foreign countries, really as a goodwill gesture, but also as an opportunity to bring an American brand of art into what was called the host country. In 1974, I found myself, I turned 20 on this tour, and had never been out of this country before, so I was really frightened. We arrived in Santiago, Chile. This was 1 year after Allende had been assassinated, at a time when the American Embassy staff was so nervous by their very existence there that they spent most of their time drinking and sweating in equal measure. We spent a week there living up to the military curfews that were imposed on us. It was an intriguing time. A week later, we ended up in Lima, Peru. And this is where my experience occurred. To give you a setting of the time. So, August 1974, there is a portrait of Richard Nixon. And the man unassumingly and quietly is bringing his stepladder out, and he has a picture under his arm. And we're watching him. He climbs the ladder, and he takes down the picture of Richard Nixon and puts the picture of Gerald Ford in its place. And at that moment, we realized what had happened. And that's literally how the four of us learned that there had been a change in leadership in Washington, which was expected, though not with certainty that it was going to happen on a particular day. It was a little unsettling being out of the country at that moment in time, particularly in a South America that at this point in time could not understand the notion of a peaceful transition of power. And thought certainly that some sort of blood-filled coup would necessarily follow the demise of a sitting president. So we were proud to talk at length about the American system that provides for a peaceful transition of power. Anyway, we end up in a car and begin our departure from the very civilized and charming city of Lima, and begin, the four of us, a trek up the Andes Mountains. And we go over the site called Teclio, which is the highest point in the Andes Mountains that a car is able to pass through over a rather forbidding roadway, and settled 6 hours later into the city of Huancayo. Huancayo is a town of several thousand people, most of whom are impoverished and are used as laborers in the copper mines that are not far away from the city of Huancayo. And when we arrived in the city, it was rather disturbing because we couldn't see any people. There were no people. The car took us to our hotel, and there was one man who escorted us to our rooms, and because of the altitude that the city resides in, we were each given an odd kind of tank and a face mask which contained oxygen in case, because the air was so thin, people who were not acclimated to that environment sometimes passed out. So they said, oh, if you feel like you're going to pass out, take some oxygen, particularly when you're performing, which was the point of our being there. They also told us to make sure that we did not sleep with our space heaters on, because the space heaters could eat all the oxygen in the room and could suffocate you if you left them on through the night. So we thought, this is an interesting place to be. But we still could not quite fathom the reason why there were no people. Where were they all? So we gathered after dumping off our bags in our rooms and headed out into the town. And it was right out of a Stephen King novel, street after street of empty homes and businesses, until suddenly in the distance we could hear the sound of people, and we couldn't tell if it was chanting or laughter or some sort of political demonstration, but we knew, oh, there are a lot of people around here somewhere. We'll follow the sound. After making several turns, we looked ahead and we could see that we had arrived at the town square, the city square, which had a large and ancient Spanish-styled church and a few stores, and I guess what would be the equivalent of a city hall, all surrounding a grassy area in the middle with a fountain. And surrounding that square were thousands of people. Literally every resident in the city of Huancayo, save for the man who put us in our hotel rooms, was assembled at that square. And we thought, what's going on that this whole town would be gathered here in one place? In a place that clearly had very few televisions, if any. Radio, that the signal was so imperfect that they would tell us that occasionally in the middle of the night you could get a signal and hear radio. So they did not have, and there was no movie theater of any kind. So there's thousands of people in this town square, and we kind of make our way through the crowd to see what it is they're looking at. And what we see, what we discover in the middle of this square are two boys. One about 16 years old, one I'd say about 12 or 13. And they are enacting an improvisation in which the older of the two boys, who wore a costume that suggested he was a man of some wealth, and he carried bits of copper in his pockets. Remember that this is the labor force for the copper mine. And the younger boy was clearly a person of lesser station, whose job it was to outwit the rich man and steal his copper. All of this done through comedic comedic routines that were probably performed for centuries, all the way back to the Italian Commedia dell'arte, which these boys, I can guarantee you, had no knowledge of. In that moment, I realized, as I watched the town people riveted by the art of these two boys, which was very practiced, you could see on their faces the delight every time the poorer of the two struck gold or copper in this case, and you could realize that there was an identification with this story and with this narrative in a way that was quite powerful, and that it wasn't just the simplicity of the stooge-like antics of the boys, but there was something about their lives that was being reflected back to them by these two actors in their midst. This went on easily for over an hour, until finally at the end, the thousands of people applauded the boys, who left triumphant, having now been rewarded with meager coins of gratitude from the masses of the city, and the people left the square and went about their lives. In that moment, I realized that the art of theater was not a choice, but was a human necessity. That in fact, if it didn't exist, people would make sure it did. That the theater speaks something about the human propensity to imitate itself, to itself, in order to gain a perspective on the meaning of life, the power of life, and perhaps glean experiences that we don't have by being able to identify and engage with them vicariously through the imagined moment. Every time I questioned the necessity of a life in the theater, I hearken back to that story, and I am comforted by the notion that this is not a decorative part of the human experience. It is an essential part of the human experience. To go back to my prepared thoughts briefly, as a theater artist, I am one of those boys. And part of my life is spent teaching people who think they might be one of them too. We are our stories. They define not only who we are, but who we aspire to be. They reveal our biggest fears and our biggest hopes. Our stories confess, they liberate, they identify just who we are. And as they are the most perfect primary source for the study of us, who we are, who we were, who we might become, they demand attention in their recall, artfulness in their telling, and belief in their capacity to tell the truth. Think about your stories, the ones that define who you are as a person, who you might be, who you want to be, and carefully, artfully, tell them. Thank you.